people say to me, well, haven't Genesis got all this footage somewhere? And the answer is no.
I'm very honored to be speaking with John Edginton, who's the director of the BBC documentary on Genesis from a few years ago. And we actually talk about the origins of that documentary. We talk about the conversations he's had with the band. And we also talk about the new YouTube channel that he started, a very successful YouTube channel that has amassed over 4.5 million views. It's incredible in such a short amount of time. A lot of our fans and friends in the Genesis and Phil Collins community have loved to see this raw footage from the documentary. There's so much I think you're going to enjoy from today's interview. And to celebrate this chat with John, I'm giving away one copy of his documentary, Some of the Parts, the BBC documentary on Blu-ray, to one lucky winner. To be entered, all you have to do is subscribe to my channel here and subscribe to John's channel as well. And then go to everythingphilcollins.com and enter your email for a chance to win a Blu-ray copy, and we'll notify someone in a couple of weeks. Hope you enjoy the interview. I watched the documentary again this week, and let's start with Phil, because you know, that's what we're about. But yeah. I had already seen it a couple of years ago, many times actually, but I watched it just yesterday just to kind of freshen up. One of the things I loved about it and the raw videos of your YouTube channel was it felt like Phil was in a really good mood. Can you tell me about where this was, some of the conversations you had with Phil and when this was and what his demeanor was like? He just seemed like really agreeable.
Yeah. He was really agreeable. Well, it came about, I was invited to direct the documentary. I met with Tony Smith, Mike Rutherford, and Tony Banks, discussed it. And the big question was Phil's health, actually, at that point. And this would be 2013, sort of autumn time. So, you know, Tony Smith was saying, look, I'll talk to Phil about this, you know. He's kind of coming out of a dark period, you know, and there was this sense in which, you know, he said he was going to retire, and then was he going to come back? You know, it was touch and go whether actually he would take part in the documentary.
Okay.
So I said, well, I basically spend most of my time in New York. So I said, well, look, why don't I go and chat with him about it? Right. So that's how the initial meeting with Phil came about. And it wasn't a filmed interview. It was it was arranged that Phil was amenable. I met him in actually the Trump Hotel, would you believe it? On Central Park West, where he was doing an interview. He was actually doing an interview about drumming for some young guys who were putting together something.
Wow.
Which might have been for a YouTube channel, I can't remember. And he was doing this interview, and he would, you know, have time to have a chat with me afterwards. So I thought, well, he's up for doing interviews.
That's a good point.
I don't believe he was doing this officially. I think this was entirely off his own bat, you know.
Right.
So he said, look, let's get a coffee. We went downstairs to the hotel dining room, which was full, you know, and if you're going to walk in there with Phil Collins and it's full and you just want a coffee, and he took one look and I said, you want to go somewhere else? He said, why don't we go to my apartment? It's just up the street.
Wow.
So we walked out, got a cab. 5 minutes later, we were in Phil's apartment in New York. A very modest venue, I have to say, for, you know,
sure,
multi-millionaire superstar. And, you know, my memory is for the next 3 hours, Phil sat on a couch and told me about what had happened to him in the last few years and how he'd got to this point. And how, you know, he told me about his health problems, about his back, his surgery, in a sense, his alcoholism, which he kind of accepted at that point, that he had been an alcoholic for at least 2 or 3 years, and he was stopping it. He'd been to rehab. He said he lasted about 5 days in rehab. Oh. He said his room was next to the sort of pharmacy room. And he said, you wake up in the morning and these guys are all queuing up for their medication. And he said, after 5 days of this, I thought, I'm getting out of here. Too depressing for anything.
Sure, I imagine.
So, he was completely free talking to me in a way that, a lot of what he told me then turned up in his biography.
Right.
Where he's very open and tells much of this. But at the time, I was pretty amazed. I thought, you've never met me. I'm this guy who could be immediately going to, TMZ. But of course, the whole thing has always been based on trust with me. And that's in a sense how I get good interviews.
Right.
So what was fascinating about that meeting, actually, that conversation, was that Phil said, look, if we're going to do a documentary, all of us, all 5 of us should meet up.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And I said, great. So he said, we need to get Peter Gabriel. And he said, and we need to get Steve Hackett, And I said, great. Now, what I wish I'd said was, and what about Anthony Phillips? Yeah. However, that's a digression. I can tell you about that. I said, look, this would be fantastic. And of course, everybody would love that to be filmed. Yeah. And he said, well, that's my condition for making the documentary. He said, wow. Tell the guys, tell Tony Smith. I said, well, you're going to have to tell them. They're not going to listen to me. He said, okay, I'll tell them. So we, on that basis, the documentary was approved by Phil Collins.
Amazing.
Very, very quickly, because this was early January 2014. Okay. I'm pretty sure that the first interview took place by the end of January. Wow. Because I was there and I said to Phil, well, if everyone agrees, when do you want to do this? He said, let's do it soon. He said, a couple of weeks. And I said, sure, and I thought he's really got this great sort of open, honest kind of sense about him right now. He seems ready to talk.
He must have been writing the book at that time then.
He never mentioned a book to me. I'm not sure that he was, actually.
Yeah, I don't know actually when it came out. I want to say maybe 2016. Yeah, I can't recall, but I just wonder if one or the other was a lead into opening up a little bit at that stage of his life.
I don't think he was opening. I don't think he was writing the book. I think once the whole documentary come out, and then he got the reactions to it, because he emailed me a few weeks after it was shown, and said, thanks so much. This is I'm getting so much, so many good comments from friends, from family. Said it's really been a boost. So I think that was, maybe that propelled the book.
Sure. That's interesting. This is a good segue, because sometimes rock stars have this mysterious persona, which is often put on, more often not, a put on persona, and intentionally elusive or aloof. Yeah. And to my eyes, Phil has never done that. And in your interviews, he seems so down to earth, for lack of a better term. Yeah. self-deprecating. I mean, that's one of the things I've always loved about Phil, and you see that the most in the documentary, and in your videos.
Yes. I think he is he's the real Phil. You know, he's not
the real deal.
He's not pretending.
Yeah.
You know, he's not this sort of public relations Phil. He's the guy who, if you sit and chat with him, he talks. To me, certainly, he was chatting away just the same when we weren't rolling the camera. I think that's him.
Yeah.
He's very straightforward, but he's one of the great things about him. He's got a fantastic sense of humor, which you know, I managed.
It came out a lot in the documentary.
Yeah.
Oh, there's some incredible laugh out loud moments in the doc and also in the videos that didn't make the doc. I'm curious about your history with Genesis and with Phil before the documentary started, because and you have a great rapport with Phil, and in fact in the videos you're even teasing him a little bit. So talk to me about that setup a little bit.
Well, the wonderful thing about Phil is that he completely got what I was up to, because I have always said, you know, I always say when I'm interviewing, you know, rock stars, shall we say, or, you know, the celebrity, that it's no good just having me, you know, I'm not interested in coming to a kind of set up in a PR office, you know, and doing a quick half hour and then I'm out, you know. It's just not going to work. This is a documentary that's going to dig deep. Yeah. And you want it to dig deep. You don't want just the same old Phil stuff. And I said this to all the guys. They responded in different ways. And you can tell by the quality of the interviews who gave me the most time. So Phil gave me the most time.
Wow.
But we got to the end of the 2.5 to 3 hour first session, and we'd got to 1980, 1981, you know.
Yeah.
And he said, you know, I just realized, he said, I haven't eaten. And you know, I said, well, look, you shouldn't be put through any more of this today, you know.
Yeah.
Let's do another session. We'd planned that he would come to London. Let's do another session when you're in London, right? And he says, yeah. He said, then we'll probably get to 1990, and then we'll do another session. And I said, great, let's keep going. You know, this is fantastic. Because that way, the more you meet someone and the more you film them, the more at ease they become, you know, and these other layers come through. Yeah. Second session happened to be in the Dorchester Hotel in London. Okay. And Phil was in an entirely different mood, and you can tell that. And that's some of those. Well, there's some clips from that in the documentary, but some of those longer set pieces are from that session.
Interesting.
And where he's much more thoughtful, and he's kind of more bittersweet about things. And he seemed a little lonely, kind of.
Oh, wow. Very interesting.
Yeah, it was, that was interesting too. Mm-hmm. But I still managed to tease him, you know. I managed to tease him about the short sticks that he played.
The short sticks, that's what I was thinking of. About his son. That's funny. Right from the opening sequence of the documentary, you immediately highlight the juxtaposition of the Peter years and the Phil years. Right. And that's a dichotomy that a lot of fans have to decide if they're willing to accept. And, you know, this artsy 70s prog rock, then, you know, with the stadium filling pop band a decade later. There's this hilarious quote in the film. Someone says, they're a progressive rock band that progressed. Fans want progressive rock bands to stop 2 albums into their progressing and progress no more. How did you initially plan to tackle that polarizing evolution?
I'm not sure that I did initially plan to tackle it in that sense. What happened was once you get into the editing, what a shape kind of emerged, and clearly the obvious shape is the changing sound and just changing personalities of Genesis. And it was hard to do it any other way than do it chronologically,
right?
To tell the story in any other way. I mean, it's a bit of a cliche telling the story from the beginning to the end,
right.
you know. But it's such a complex story. I couldn't see any other way that would really work. I have to say that the film went through some very difficult periods late in the day after the first rough cut was produced.
Okay.
You know, I know a lot of people who love Genesis and are fans of Genesis, especially fans of the early, you know, more progressive.
Yeah.
Hate the documentary.
Right.
And
okay.
Steve Hackett came out and said some very critical things about how he was used in the documentary.
I see.
Now, I think it's 8 or 9 years later. I'm quite happy to tell you the truth of the whole story is that the rough cut did not have any of the journalists, the comedians commenting, the writers commenting. It was purely told in the words of Genesis.
Wow.
It was an attempt to kind of tell it in their, you know, using the interviews, using the footage, obviously the archive, and telling it in their own words. Now, the problem with this was that it was commissioned by the BBC. And the BBC have, at times, a very interventionist approach to their, you know, they pretty much paid for it, essentially.
Wow.
So Tony Smith, on his own, came to the first screening of the rough cut and appeared to love it. He was very, very encouraging. He just thought it was great, going along the right lines. The BBC commissioning editor, who shall not be named, came a couple of days later. And I mean, the problem was that she saw Genesis as the 80s Genesis.
Right.
She said it's only when you get to, actually she said, which it wasn't even Genesis at all, it's only when you get to In the Air Tonight that you start to say, oh, okay, now I know where I am, you know.
I see.
And I mean, I understand that when it's being funded by the BBC and it's on a main channel at the prime time on Saturday night.
Yeah.
It's for an audience that doesn't really know that much about the Peter Gabriel years, right? And so she was absolutely adamant that we had to have these outsider kind of commentators, et cetera, coming in. To me, it was a bitter pill to swallow, but I was a hired hand, essentially. So it turned out to be not something that in my kind of work as an auteur I would hold up very highly as a documentary. I know it's got some great moments, but what I love about putting out these longer takes from the interviews is that the real Genesis fans have kind of really seized on them because you're getting an hour and 15 minutes of Tony Banks talking, no interruptions,
and 250,000 people are watching it.
Yeah, exactly.
Unbelievable.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. That's the kind of numbers that a NBC TV show would be happy with.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
It's crazy. Yeah.
I've only been doing this for just over a year. And I think the Genesis interviews I only started doing last October. I started feeling my way with them. I mean, a lot of them are taken from very kind of low-res hard drive material, that was used, the footage used in the edit.
Right. Yeah.
Compressed, not great quality. And I've had to sort of play around and pump them up as much as I can and so on.
Sure.
But there you go.
Let me just go back to what you were just talking about. And I think that problem of those eras and how do you tell this condensed 90-minute story this is a problem of of Genesis forever. And it's a problem when they go on tour. People are never happy with their set lists.
Right.
It's a problem when they try to put together compilations and greatest hits. People are, so I think it's their cross to bear. It's really, I imagine it's really tough for them and in your position as well.
Well, what's interesting is how much they in a sense, they're a little bit in denial about this because they will argue, I mean, Tony Back says, no, there are much longer songs, in the mid to late 80s Genesis. It's not all short songs. It's not all Phil love songs. And Phil will say, it's not all my love song, It's, there's some great long stuff, and they will bring back the old stuff to some degree, which is, something like Carpet Crawlers is absolutely standard in the live shows. Mm-hmm. And then there's the Phil song that he wrote about the guys who built the railroads.
Yeah, driving the last spike. Yeah. And that's a long 10-minute song. Yeah,
but of course, you can argue forever. Is that progressive rock? Is that
Sure. Well, that's what was so interesting in the interviews that I've seen is that the band members seems to be a non-story for them. Is this idea of evolution? I think it was actually Tony who said something about you just do what feels right with the people you're with in that moment. And I think of it, for them, it must be like a parent watching a kid grow up. You don't notice it day to day.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that's Phil's attitude too, very much, actually. And I think that the conflict with Phil has been that he became successful writing personal songs initially.
Yeah.
Very personal songs. And then how to fit in with Genesis and the Genesis audience. And I think that's been something that's kind of haunted him a little and made him quite unpopular with, some of the comments on my channel, you can see that people are like really anti-Phil.
Right.
Which I find really annoying. But
yeah,
as I said to some guy today, he said, well, you just leave off the anti-Phil stuff. You said, every single, there's this one guy who, every single video I put up from Phil, he'll come in with his anti-Phil nonsense.
Yeah.
And goes, Susu Studio, and he'd say, okay, take me down then. I was like, no, I'm not going to remove you. Free speech, but just leave it off.
It's such an injustice, and you would know this better, but it's such an injustice to Tony and Mike to say that Phil controlled them.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, when Phil talks, I think this comes through, is that he's very beholden to Tony. So I think when he was talking about misunderstanding, he talked about how he was influenced a little bit by the Beach Boys, the sound of the Beach, one of those tracks, and how he'd written it as a kind of you know, but well, still having, you know, it's got some piano in it. It's kind of and he said, and Tony really loved it, right? So you would think that would be on face value, but no, absolutely not.
Tony wanted it.
Tony wants it. Tony loves it. You know, so it goes on Duke. It's not Mike wants it and loves it. It's Tony.
Yeah, good point.
I think Tony's control is one of the stories behind the Genesis. It's Tony's kind of sense of what's right at every stage.
Did you get a sense, speaking of Tony, did you get a sense of tension that still might linger between Tony and Peter? There's a scene talking about the lamb where they're both being honest, but it seemed that the water wasn't completely under the bridge. Did you get that sense at all?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Peter's, you know, Peter's would kind of laugh and say, well, you know, what a stubborn bastard he was and still is, you know. And Tony, to some extent, was a little kind of rueful, you know, saying, well, you know I was, but I think I'm better now, and, you know, stop beating me up, kind of. But they were so kind of the closest friends at school, you know, in the initial kind of stages. I think their friendship was the one that was, they would probably always go back to and say that was the spark, along with, of course, with Anthony Phillips.
Yeah, there's as you're watching and as we're describing those conversations in the photographer's studio with all of them, there's moments where they all seem like they're 20 years old or 19 years old, just picking at each other. And that's what I love about the raw, the zoomed out footage is just incredible to watch all of their faces react to a joke.
Yeah.
So interesting.
I'm so pleased I managed to resurrect that to some degree. I mean, I would go to the file and look at it and think, this is unwatchable, you know, because it's such a raw state. It's all from one camera. The sound, my sound is terrible because there's no, we're not using, the mic sound from my mic isn't picked up on this one camera. That's the only footage I have of it. And people say to me, well, haven't Genesis got all this footage somewhere? And the answer is no. Nobody has it, you know. It's like, this is what happens. These things just get binned.
When we talk about the YouTube channel, we'll go down that road because the raw footage is really, it's something else, and it breaks that fourth wall. And even your audio, I know people have complained about it, but I don't think they understand what we're being given. So to me, the lo-fi nature of it, it actually complements it. It makes it more exciting, more honest. So I love that. What about this rough cut? Will that see the light of day?
Sorry, which?
The rough cut that you were talking about that you first showed management.
I think it's impossible because it's got so much. It's impossible to make it without all the copyrighted material.
Oh, I understand.
All the archive footage.
Yes, I understand.
I mean, I came cropper with copyright last week, which you know, I know they're right, but I think it's very small-minded. What I did was there's a piece I put out with Phil listening to the Lamb and responding to it. Yep. You might, if you'd watched it in the first few days, you'll have seen it with him listening and heard the music, right?
Oh, okay. I was wondering why you uploaded a recut. Okay.
So I got a copyright strike.
Yep.
About the music. This is Phil listening to the Lamb.
Yeah.
So I appealed on the grounds of fair use because in this case, he's talking over it for some of the time and he's responding to it, and it's like he's commenting, etc. Now, I don't know if it's an algorithm that then kicks in. And goes, get the fuck off this. But they issued a second kind of warning and took it down.
Oh, wow.
So I now have
That's
a
interesting.
copyright strike against me. I have to be a very good boy for the next 3 months. So
That's
otherwise,
right.
they could have the power, of course, to remove the entire channel.
Yeah, and they don't really, as special as it is, they're not necessarily Genesis fans. So you're
exactly.
one of a billion channels.
Right.
Yeah.
So so the rough cut, it's just not going to happen.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Apparently, there's. I want to ask you about something that doesn't get talked about a lot, and apparently, there's some discord that took place between Chester and Phil at some point in the last 10 years, and I can't speak to that at all. But the moments where Chester, in the raw footage especially, is speaking about Phil, and vice versa, they're really sweet moments. Really heartwarming. Yeah. Maybe I'm just projecting, but I love seeing their admiration for each other's talent.
Yeah, I love that too. I'm afraid I was far too kind of, I did not want to raise it with Chester.
Yeah.
Because I thought that might change how he was in the interview. So I came in and said, he's an incredibly friendly guy. He's very sweet. He gave us a great interview. And I just left it alone. I knew what had happened because I didn't ask Phil about it either, actually. I didn't want to influence him talking about Chester.
Yeah.
And people saying, well, why didn't you get to the bottom of it? Well, it's in Rolling Stone. You can read it, And Chester has talked about it recently. Everyone knows what happened because it's out there. It's not. Yeah. It's the story has been told.
There's speaking of something else sensitive. One of the things, and maybe this you can speak to this from your rough cut, was how the documentary omitted the Ray Wilson era and the Calling All Stations era. And so, a lot of fans I'm seeing, and not just with the documentary, but a lot of fans kind of criticize the band of being a little bit revisionist and the enterprise of Genesis kind of trying to make that era disappear. What were your thoughts on that?
Well, I think there's some power and control element in this. I mean, when you're making a documentary about where there's a music legends, they all have their own version of how they would like it to be, and to settle on a kind of happy medium. I guess Tony Smith had a big role to play too, as the manager. But it seemed to be a generally conveyed view that if you're going to try and make this show in 90 minutes, let's stick to the kind of story that it's almost like Phil never really left. Although we do mention that he left, but back again in 2007,
not too much longer.
And the Ray Wilson story just gets completely left out. I mean, some people think it's whitewash. But there is a case there. I mean, an hour and a half, you can't tell the story of everything. It's not a Wikipedia article about Genesis.
Yeah, that's true.
I mean, and the other big bone of contention is why is Steve Hackett's solo work not included? And of course, people read into it also the way Steve is treated in the group filming.
Yeah.
Right? That's just unfortunate because there's one, we see one camera's shots. Steve's on the end. There are actually 3 cameras. One of them is covering Steve and Phil and Peter the whole time. And that, if you look at the documentary, is actually cut in with Steve responding. That third camera is there. But unfortunately, on this central camera, which does move slightly that way, Steve tends to get pushed off. So the conspiracy theorists are all about, aha, there you see, look at the way they're filming Steve.
Steve has a lot of defenders. Yeah.
Yeah. His solo work is, the honest truth of it is that Mike wanted more of his stuff in.
Well, I was going to say the band branches out so far, and Small Creeps wasn't mentioned, and a lot, and Mike and the Mechanics were, in some cases, almost as successful as Phil was, and same with some of Peter's stuff, and there's just so much, so much.
Once you go down that route, if I'd had my way, we wouldn't have had any of the solo stuff at all. We'd have stuck straight, just kept in there with Genesis, the story, and left out all that.
I would imagine the difficulty would have been, and this is what we're talking about, trying to touch on every facet, and the solo albums and the singles, and it's not a linear story, even though you're now trying to force yourself into that.
Right.
So this is where the YouTube channel comes in, and and you start to understand now what Peter Jackson, why he had an 8-hour documentary or 16-hour documentary. This seems to make so much more sense. So tell me about the genesis of your YouTube channel, if you don't mind the pun.
The genesis of my YouTube channel is the pandemic, really, and not being out there making documentaries, obviously feeling a little frustrated. And one of my daughter, who's in her 30s and is very media savvy, she kept saying to me, Dad, you should have a YouTube channel. And I kept saying, well, I don't know. It's like, I don't really have a lot of stuff. What do I have, actually? And I couldn't put out the Genesis documentary because I don't own it. Yeah, I can't put out the Joe Cocker film because it's still doing the rounds. It was on Netflix. I don't have the distribution rights to it. Sure. I don't. The Pink Floyd films, one of them I own, but I gave it to a distributor, and so they're distributing. I can't put that stuff out. Mm-hmm. I have some old documentaries I can put out, but that's not going to grow an audience. And it was the initial thing was, okay, let's see, let's try it, let's see how we can go with this. So it was very tentative. I didn't see the potential until I put up one thing that had been a DVD extra, and it was a Pink Floyd documentary, the Pink Floyd and Syd Barrett story. And on the DVD, I'd put some lengthy selections from the interviews with David Gilmour and Roger Waters, Nick Mason. And I put up the Gilmour, which was 35 minutes long, on the DVD. And suddenly I start to see the views, right? So I put up the Roger Waters one. Very quickly, I got my 1,000 subscribers that you need to be a YouTube partner, in quotes.
Yeah, to monetize, yeah.
Yeah, and, we were off. And then I started to think, well, hang on. Those interviews are only a selection of what I have on tape. Go and digitize the tapes, because these are all interviews shot 20 years ago. And so it grew from that. So by the time we got to September, October 2021, I had got a roaring kind of success going with Pink Floyd. The full David Gilmour interview is just like several thousand views every single day for the last year.
Unbelievable.
It's an hour and I think it's an hour and a half, something like that. So then I sort of thought, well, what about Genesis? And that seemed a little more problematic because, as I was saying, they're very compressed, low-level, low-res videos, and also they've got a time code running through them.
Sure.
which is no way you can get rid of unless you resize the picture.
Yeah.
And it meant lopping off the top of heads and doing all kinds. Recently, I decided to try not to do that, and I put out one with Phil where you have the time code on it.
Yeah.
And no one seems to mind. So,
well, I think it adds to it adds to the transparency of it.
Right.
I'd say put a fake time code on there. It looks more behind the scenes.
Well, I'll ask you this. I thought of putting out the group session, which is, at the moment, it's in 4 parts, I think, 4 20-minute sections.
Yeah.
I thought of putting it out in a, slightly edited down, but maybe an hour and a half, 90 minutes, but with the time code running through it, so it doesn't have the heads lopped off. I think people might get more of a sense of the whole thing from that.
Yeah, sure.
As a separate upload,
No, absolutely. And I often, when I'm on your channel, I'm always worried that I've missed something. I thought, have I seen this one? Because the thumbnails are from the same shoot. So I want to make sure I haven't missed anything. So yeah, absolutely. I think people would love that. What does this tell you about people's appetite for content these days? Because, you've been making these polished, finished products. Right. And also, how does it speak to the future of documentaries?
That's a good one. Well, my feeling about people's appetite for content is that I always had this sense that we were selling people short. You're doing, and in fact, increasingly with documentaries, you're doing sound bites. You're doing, you have 2 sentences from someone and then jump. And editors have learned this is the way to go with it. Now, in the earlier days of like the Penny Baker film about Bob Dylan, Don't Look Back, when Dylan's in 1966, he would allow long takes to run, great scenes would develop. There's Dylan on a piano in a hotel room, with Joan Baez sitting at his feet, kind of thing, and it would run. And then Gimme Shelter, which is about the Stones performing in Altamont, So now, I think what's happened is that the kind of rush forward, say NTV perhaps has encouraged us to, that when it comes to music, people are told maybe or shown that they want something fast moving, something that's kind of like, and got the music in it, and you can. But I would say, well, you're not going to dance to a documentary, so why don't you just sit down and watch the damn thing? And it's got so many layers to it, right? The music is one layer. Obviously, if you're doing a story it's got a whole set of other layers. I always feel the emotional side gets left out. There's classic album series, which is a series where you take an album and you tell the story of it.
Sure.
There's often been too kind of like dry and nerdy, where musos, as I call, can sit for hours and talk about how that was achieved. That little musical note. But I mean, I did this film, The Story of Wish You Were Here, the Pink Floyd album. And, you could get totally into that from the point of view of somebody who's like obsessed with Pink Floyd sound. But this is a story about these guys struggling at a crucial stage of their career. They could have been breaking up at this point. They didn't really like each other anymore. There was a power struggle going on. I want to get all that in. Yeah. And that's in the same with the Genesis story, is that, from the first moment I talked to Phil, the very first time, he would make these very wry jokes about Tony,
Right.
he told the story of how he and Peter Gabriel, when Tony wasn't there, would rehearse with Peter on the drums and Phil on the piano,
right,
or Peter on the piano and Phil on the, they would play around. They would try and work up something together. And Tony would come in after and go, "Who's been touching the piano? Who's on it? Who was on this?"
Sure.
Like, this is my territory. This is my piano.
Yeah. I think it was an organ part or something in I Know What I Like that they recorded. Yeah.
And he still had this feeling about Tony to this day.
Wow.
That's
incredible.
That kind of ribbing about that kind of thing when they got together.
And there was you get this sense that there's a truth behind some of the humor, some of the jokes. When Tony says we wanted Phil to be successful, just not that successful.
Yes, exactly.
And there's a truth to it.
Yes, there is.
Yeah. Which I appreciate, because I think I would feel the same way. If I was a contemporary, if I had a friend who became more successful than me, we're all going to feel the same way.
I mean, in a sense, they were lucky that Phil came back from the point of view of the life of Genesis.
Yeah.
I don't think calling all stations was going to be their kind of epitaph, really.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Is there more Genesis content in your archives, or has everything been shared?
There's always more.
That's good. Well, let me ask you this. What's next for you and for the channel?
Well, what I realize is I have so many things I can put out. There's a lot of material that's on old tapes that I need to get digitized. I'm doing this at my own pace in a way, and I'm doing it at my own pace because I enjoy doing it.
Right.
And it's a nice change for me at the moment. I've had a few people getting in touch and saying, would you like to make a film about this? Would you like, but I'm only going to say yes if it's absolutely clicks with something I really want to make a film about more than anything. And also if there's funding there to make it.
Sure.
The most difficult thing ever for me in doing self-funded projects is, looking at the bank balance afterwards.
Yeah, right. That's right.
Yeah. So
are you enjoying playing the role of producer and distributor and broadcaster now? And
yes.
Have you thought about original content for the channel, like your stories and you as an individual?
I've given it some thought. I mean, I think I'd love to do that.
Good.
You want to encourage me?
Yes, please do. Please do. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's always fun to tell the stories behind some of these. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, the appetite for a fan of a band is infinite. That's what I personally, I just can't get enough. And if your videos were 8 hours long of Phil sitting there talking, saying, I want to grab lunch, talking about his kids, joking with you, I would watch it all multiple times. It really does seem like, and especially for a band that is seemingly over and we're not going to get new things from them.
Yes.
The appetite is even more intensified.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think I did 3 long interviews with Phil. The first in his apartment in New York, the second in the hotel room in London, and the third was in this small edit suite.
Okay.
Just a little room that he'd set up and was using in 2014. He was supposed to be writing songs. He said, at least that's what I tell my girlfriend. At that point, he wasn't back in Miami with his ex-wife.
Right.
And in fact, his girlfriend had encouraged him to get set up to get back into writing. And I think that there was talk. He talked about how he'd been contacted by Adele to write a song for her, but
yes, I've heard that. Yeah,
that sort of came to nothing. But in that third interview, I think all the best. There's some really great stuff, and it's all this stuff about his drumming and his voice. So I put out a video the other day about how did he manage to keep his voice going when at some certain point in the 80s, they were actually doing 2 shows a day, Genesis.
Right.
And so it's just a nice piece on his voice, the wisdom of how you keep your voice going. Although he says at the end, I really had no idea. just not lose my voice. Sort of.
Yeah, well, it was just luck, I think. Now, he didn't fare so well with his body when it comes to his posture and his ergonomics. But yeah, the voice just must be luck, because some artists will lose their voice in their 30s after what he's done. But yeah, incredible.
I mean, the drumming side of it, Chester actually said that he thought the reason Phil's had so many issues with his back and his shoulders was the way he sits. And the fact that he hit the drum so hard, which Phil talks about being his kind of
signature.
Signature, exactly. But Chester could be right. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, John, thank you so much for taking the time to do this, and more importantly, thank you for sharing all of this content. It has been incredible for us to have access to this. So, thank you so much for doing this.
Well, I'm delighted that people are finding the channel, and the fans are getting a lot of, great sort of, stories that they haven't heard before, or reactions that they haven't seen. At least it appears to be fresh and new to quite a lot of people, which is great.
Well, absolutely. And just one more thought on just what you're releasing is, you were talking about documentaries about just how polished everything is, and all of the TV appearances we would see of these artists were just so perfect and polished. And so to see them take a beat to think, or to make a little joke under their breath, that's the magic, in my opinion.
Yeah.
I hope you enjoyed today's chat with John. What a great guy. So many cool things we uncovered. For a chance to win a Blu-ray copy of this documentary, go to everythingphilcollins.com to enter for a chance to win. Thanks so much for watching.